What my guest is about to present is absolutely shocking. I watched the Coronation and it screamed world dictator, but my guest has uncovered symbolism and things that all of us didn't see. We absolutely missed it. And my guest is Tim Cohen.
Hi, Janie.
Hi. Okay, but before we get to that, and before we get to the Grim Reaper and that dark figure that everyone has been talking about, I wanted to read something, okay? And it's from NPR, and it said, after a procession into Westminster, the public, even people watching on TV from home, will be asked to swear allegiance to King Charles. In past coronations, it was only the aristocrats in the room who were asked to do this. Okay, Tim, I want you to comment about that.
Yeah, that was done right after the Archbishop of Canterbury and Prince William of Wales, Charles' son, swore allegiance to Charles after he had been crowned and anointed. So they swore allegiance to him, and then Charles himself asked the entire world, basically, not just the British Commonwealth, but everyone watching around the world to swear allegiance to him at the same moment. It was very much a form of witchcraft, Janie, where they try to speak something into existence. It's a counterfeit of God speaking things into existence. And in witchcraft, their words supposedly take form and shape in the occult realm. That's what they believe. And so it was basically trying to manifest a reality of loyalty from the world to Charles as king.
And that's never happened before.
No, it's never been done in history. There were several new things in this coronation that have never happened in history.
Okay, now I watched the Coronation after the fact, but I watched a recording. And I saw some things that really were very questionable. But then when you sent me some of the images that you had found, it was definitely, I'm like, oh my goodness, he has uncovered a whole bunch of stuff. So everyone has to stay tuned. Okay, start.
So the event, we've talked about Charles, you and I, in our prior interviews as the foretold AntiChrist, the hard evidence for him biblically being that individual and being the fourth horseman of the apocalypse. And in Revelation chapter 6, verses 7 to 8, that horseman is called Death. That's his name. And Hades follows with him. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Satan is identified as Death, and also the last enemy that is swallowed up, destroyed by the Lord at the end of the millennial kingdom is death. Satan will be loosed again at the end of the millennial kingdom briefly to tempt mankind one last time. And then the great white throne judgment, etc., will occur. The final enemy, death, will be swallowed up. But the fourth horseman of the apocalypse, the Antichrist, is identified as death. The reason for that, Janie, is he's possessed by the devil. Now, I bring up the context there for multiple reasons. The horse that he is riding, and the unicorn, by the way, on Charles' heraldic achievement, is a pale green-gray unicorn of the horse's body, boar's hooves, and, of course, a unicorn's horn, but with human eyes, a man's eyes. The horse of the fourth horseman in Revelation chapter 6, verses 7 to 8, is pale green-gray, the color of rotting human flesh. Some would call that ashen. It's been translated ashen or pale, sometimes golden, almost like a golden kind of an ash, but pale green-gray is the most literal meaning. Here's why I bring that up. On the way to the coronation, Charles and Camilla were in the Golden State Coach. That's the coach they took on the way. They were led by horses of various colors. There was a speckled gray horse. There were mostly white horses, but those are the ones that were closest to the carriage. The carriage itself was gold. But the adornment, the arraignment of those riding these horses and what was on the horses themselves were the other colors of the four horsemen of the apocalypse.
Wow.
Yeah, I point out that the black horse, the third horse of the apocalypse, in other interviews and presentations I've given, is not black biblically. It's cerulean blue with black and gray highlights and fiery red pinkish hues, kind of like at sunset. That's the color of the third horse. But you have the red, the blue, the golden, I guess we can say, supplementing for the pale green-gray horse, in the form of the coach itself with Charles and Camilla inside, because he's the fourth horseman. And then you have, the white. So you've got all those colors mixed in as he's going to the coronation. Now, while that's happening, before he's even arrived to enter Westminster Abbey, there is the Grim Reaper that everybody was talking about passing the entrance to the Abbey, filmed from the inside.
Yeah, now I have to tell you, when I saw everybody talking, because Twitter exploded, it was on Newsweek, it was on everything. They tried to come up with an explanation. I was like, okay, I have to look at this footage. I have to find it myself because some said, it's Photoshopped. But no, it was there. So go on.
Yeah, and by the way, the Golden State coach and the riders, including the drums they had, frequently you saw the royal coat of arms as well as the state coat of arms, the difference being one has the helm and the other does not. That's really the only difference. So Charles still has his heraldic achievement as Prince of Wales, even though the title for him is dormant. It's been given now to William, the title has. Not the coat of arms, but his heraldic achievement as Prince of Wales remains his. It's unique to him under international law forever. His sons will still never have that imagery. I bring it up because he has new coats of arms as King of England, King of the UK, but they don't get rid of the old one. In other words, now he's got more coats of arms. So he has two coats of arms as king. One is the coat of arms for His Majesty's now government, which doesn't have the helm. It's just got the crown on it. It looks very similar to his mother's, when she was queen. And then the other one that he has is his royal coat of arms as king, which does have the helm. That's really the only difference between the two that's material. Then he has his cipher as king, which is Charles Rex, with the 3 in it. And I'm going to come back to the cipher. It's important, so we're going to talk about that later. But he has his cipher as king. It's a bit different from Camilla's. So it's Charles Rex versus Camilla Regina, or King Charles versus Queen Camilla, basically, is what it is, in Latin. So that being said, he has 3 new heraldic sets of devices. So one is the cipher and the other are 2 coats of arms, in addition to his original heraldic achievement as Prince of Wales. So I bring that up because on that coach, going to his coronation, and the people who were riding the horses and so forth, and the things that they had, including the drummers, they had, or excuse me, not the drummers. Well, there were drummers, yes, but the people who blew trumpets, they had the heraldic achievement of him as king hanging off of all those things as he was riding to be crowned king. All right. Now, while that's happening, and he's got that imagery of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in terms of the colors, and he's in that coach, the Grim Reaper shows up just outside the door, the entrance, I should say, to the Abbey. And that couldn't happen accidentally. I mean, they've got all kinds of security there, right? So there are 3 possibilities, but the reason I call it the Grim Reaper, regardless of which possibility is true, is because the whole public immediately thought Grim Reaper. I mean, that's what everybody thought. They didn't think of the other possibilities that I'm going to bring up. The imagery evoked in everybody's mind, the angel of death.
Yes, death. That's what everyone was talking about.
Yes. And so we've identified Charles as the 4th horseman whose name is going to be death when he's possessed by the devil, Revelation chapter 6, verses 7 to 8. So to have everybody suddenly associating death and the Grim Reaper with Charles at his coronation, because of actual imagery that happened there, that's pretty incredible. And
now I don't think it was by chance, but I mean, okay, the coronation, correct me if I'm wrong, was $125 million. Everything was like with precision. I mean, you would see the royal guards all walking in precision. I mean, it was all choreographed. So just by mistake, they say a Greek Orthodox walked by or a verger walked by. Meanwhile, I looked on Google to see what the Greek Orthodox, he has a flat top of, his hat is flat. And it's not a hood, and then the verger, it's totally different. It doesn't even look like that. So they come up with all these explanations. Okay, what do you say?
Well, in fact, I found a photo of multiple Greek Orthodox vergers, including with the outfit you're describing, but others with the actual hood that looks just like the Grim Reaper in the same photo, a group photo of them. And the most prominent of the vergers actually has a staff that looks very much like the one that was being held by the person who walked past the entrance. So it could be a verger. It could also be a druid. They also have very similar attire. Ooh. And when you blow up the image, it actually has a green fringe. Now that can happen from color distortion. When you're looking at blacks on film, it could be color distortion. It could be a druid in a dark green robe or in a black robe. So it can be a druid. It could be a verger. It could be, the angel of the death, the least likely possibility. But I think the important thing here is the symbolism to everybody was the angel of death. That's what everybody thought.
Right. And all over the world, everyone's been talking about it, and they're still talking about it.
They are. And so, yeah. So that being said, there's something else that I want to point out before we get into the coronation itself. The date on which this occurred was 6 months, 6 weeks, and 6 days after Elizabeth II's funeral.
I saw that.
Also, it was, and by the way, folks, this is not how you properly calculate the number of the beast. I'm pointing it out because they added this into the whole panoply of this coronation on purpose. In other words, they wanted these numbers to show up in the background, even though that's not the proper way to calculate the number of the beast. I've shown that in other interviews, and you and I have talked about that. Of course, it's in my book, The Antichrist and a Cup of Tea, which we can probably show on the screen here. But that being said, 6 months, 6 weeks, 6 days exactly after Queen Elizabeth II's funeral. In addition to that, May 6th of 2023, if you add up the digits, you get 18. 5, 6, 2, 2, 3. 3 times 6. The robes that Camilla and Charles wore with the long train behind them when they entered, and they switched them out from crimson to purple after. So between the not being crowned and then after being crowned, they switched the colors of them to very similar robes, but different color, to signify that then they'd been crowned. But on both of Camilla's robes, at the base, on the top, trailing at the very back end, if people could look down at the end of her robe from above, just like on her coronation chair that we'll show later, that pink chair that's got her cipher on it, her cipher was on top of her robe. Now, Camilla is married to Charles. She's his wife, right? So that would be the antithesis of the church being the wife of Christ. Her cipher has 3 6s built into its base, hidden in its base. And that was there on her robe, trailing her the whole time into the coronation. And afterwards, after being crowned, Charles' robe didn't have that. Hers did, because she's to represent the people with 666 following after the Antichrist, the anti-church, if you will. She's in that position, that symbolism as Charles' wife while being crowned in all of this. So we've got 3 instances where 666 is intentionally in the ceremony itself. So as they're entering now, so they've arrived in this Golden State coach with all this imagery of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. We've got the 6s associated with the event at least 3 times, 3 6s. As they're entering, Charles greets a number of individuals who are non-Christians, something else that's never happened before in the history of this. And by the way, the history, Janie, goes back, I read one place, about 1150 years.
Right.
So long before the formation of the Anglican Protestant Church, it was originally a quote-unquote Christian, very Christian ceremony. If you set aside all the opulence, which turns off a lot of, real Christians, because it's very showy, right? Very ornate and showy. If you set all the opulence aside, Charles' mother, Elizabeth II, had a very Christian, in terms of what was said, a very Christian coronation in 1953. This one upended all of that with multiple things. Historically, no non-Christian, no one who admitted to being a non-Christian was ever allowed to participate in one of these events historically in all that time. And supposedly Charles was getting pushback on some of the things he wanted to do in the coronation by the Archbishop of Canterbury and others. Well, he wasn't really, because they all went along with it. And I've documented in The Antichrist and a Cup of Tea, and I've expanded that now in the 2nd edition, that every Archbishop of Canterbury going back several decades has been an apostate and has been pushing sexual Satanism and other things. And by the way, 666, the way it's specified in the Greek text of Revelation 13:18, with the 3 Greek letters, if you read it backwards, it looks like sex. A lot of people don't realize that. The Greek letters, if you read them backwards for 666, It looks just like the English sex.
Whoa, my goodness.
In other words, it's almost an intimation that sexual Satanism is at the heart of worshiping the devil and the Antichrist, who's going to be possessed by the devil.
Well, Satan he's afraid of male, female. He's afraid of marriage. He's afraid of children. It's like he's wanting to stop all of that because there's power in families. There's power in marriage. So it figures.
It's about destruction of life as God intended it to be. Mm-hmm. And genetic engineering, production of chimeric hybrids. These are all part of destroying life as God intended it. Debasing and corrupting it, kind of like the Nephilim, human angel hybrids, right after the fall of humanity, what they did on earth, subsequently and off earth, as I talk about in some of my other interviews and presentations, and continuing though with the coronation. So Charles is entering, along with Camilla, into Westminster Abbey after he's been associated with the imagery of the four horsemen, as the fourth horseman, because he's in the Golden State coach. Substituting, if you will, for the fourth horse, the coloration that is. And then, after he's been preceded by his royal coat of arms, and after this ostensible angel of death has shown up, this grim reaper, now he's entering, and 666 is trailing behind Camilla on her robe, that cipher, at the top. And what does he do? He greets these non-Christians. Well, they included a Hindu, a Sikh, a Zoroastrian, a Buddhist, a Muslim, a non-believing Jewess, a Jewish rabbi. The chief rabbi of the UK spent the night with Charles the night before. A lot of people don't know that. In his home. Stayed at his home. There was a blood moon that night. Okay? So Charles comes in and he's greeting all these non-Christians right off the bat. Putting them in a position of prominence, in fact, by doing that. But he's preceded by this new cross of Wales. And I've given you images of that. The new cross of Wales, which was created before he became king. For 2 years, he had gifted the materials for that and paid for it to the church in Wales. And it's produced in a quote unquote sustainable manner from sustainable items like recycled silver, Welsh slate, wood, and all recycled. And in the center of it are 2 slivers of wood in the form of a cross, placed there to look like a cross, gifted to Charles by the Pope for that cross by Francis, Roman Catholicism Pope. So that was put in the very center beneath a semi-transparent reddish jewel, and with 12 gold ringy strands around it. There are 12 of them around that cross. This cross is to be shared by the Anglican Church of Wales, by all of its churches in Wales, with the Roman Catholic ones. They're going to share it. Now, this cross was what was used to lead Charles and Camilla into Westminster Abbey. It preceded him. And it represents ecumenism and ecumenicalism, a rejoining, if you will, of Roman Catholicism and Anglican Protestantism, something which Charles had pushed, his entire adult life, in fact, including through multiple meetings with the Pope, which his mother had pushed also with Prince Philip. A lot of people don't know that. That's documented in the Antichrist and a Cup of Tea, even the first edition of the book, published in 1998. Obviously, more has happened since then. So,
well, I know that the Archbishop of Canterbury also was pushing this.
I'll come to that. So, people ask about the false prophet, right? Who has 2 horns like a lamb in Revelation chapter 13, that other beast who rises up out of the earth, who effectively tells the world to follow after the first beast, which is the Antichrist, Charles, after he's received the mortal wound and recovered from the same. Okay? The mitre that the popes have historically worn, if you look at it from the side, has 2 horns. It looks like 2 horns like a lamb in a sense, right? Because it goes like this, right? Almost like a W inverted on top. All right. Same thing with the bishops in the Anglican Protestant Church, including the Archbishop of Canterbury. There's something very strange happened, and I'll get to the point in the ceremony where it occurred. But Charles, after being crowned, and I'm going to come back to this again, called for the whole world to pledge allegiance to him. Now, this was after the Archbishop of Canterbury and William had pledged allegiance to him. Charles called for the whole world to do that. Well, in the press, supposedly, it was the Archbishop of Canterbury who put Charles up to doing that. Now, we don't know if that's true. I have my doubts, but it could very well be that they agreed on it together. This satanic attempt to bring in a reality of the world basically being, having fealty or allegiance to Charles. Why that's so significant is that's the same kind of role. It's a precursor, if you will, to it, that the false prophet will have toward the Antichrist. So if the Archbishop of Canterbury, who also has two horns like a lamb, and this is the reason I brought up that imagery of the mitre on top of his head, put Charles up to doing that, and then calling the world to basically follow after Charles, pledge fealty to him, be loyal to him, that's very much the kind of thing that the false prophet is going to do. And the Archbishop of Canterbury has that same imagery on his mitre. Now, if these two churches come together, both apostate, at the top, if they come together, who's going to be the head bishop, if you will, between them? Probably Rome's, because Anglican Protestantism split off of Roman Catholicism historically, and Charles has been trying to reverse that. So was his mother before him. So the point is, we're getting the imagery here of the false prophet also in this coronation to an extent, along with the activity, which is to call the world to follow after the beast. Now, we're not there yet because I've gotten to the point where Charles has just entered and he's greeted these non-Christians, right? And he's being preceded by the cross of Wales that is ecumenical at its core because it's got what supposedly is two slivers of the actual cross on which Christ was crucified historically.
Right. I heard them saying that's what it was made out of.
Yeah. Now, Charles also has a crown of thorns in this event. You didn't see it on him.
No, I missed it.
No, it's on the invitation to the coronation, the green man's head.
Ooh, I saw the green man. I mean, I saw the, pan god, but.
Yeah, at the base. Okay, so I don't know if I shared it with you. I'll have to send it if I didn't. The coronation invitation for Queen Elizabeth II's, the Queen's invitation, 1953. At the base, at the bottom center of her invitation was the symbolism of basically the vestments, the sword of state, the crown, the orb, with the cross over it that represents the world under Christ, ostensibly. All that imagery was at the center bottom of her invitation to her coronation in 1953. Charles replaced all that with the green man's head, which is a pale green, lion-like, like a chimeric lion/human head with foliage growing out of the mouth and around and off the head. But on top of the head is a crown of thorns with an acorn on the top. And that was on the invitation to every guest for the event, the 2,000 guests.
I missed that part of it. Now, I did see the pan god behind the Prime Minister of the UK when he was reading scripture. There was an image of Pan behind him.
There are a lot of shocking things in the imagery that we're going to get to. But the point is, I wrote years ago, probably 10 years ago, in the second edition of the Antichrist and a Cup of Tea, while still working on it, that Charles is the green man of paganism. I had already concluded that based on his activities with Druidry and witchcraft and Satanism, he is the pagan green man. That's who he is to them today. That's who he's been for many years to them. And now, lo and behold, all of a sudden, that's the symbol that he chooses for his invitation. And by the way, it's a dead head. It's a corpse's head.
Ooh.
Okay, we're talking about another symbol of death, crowned with a crown of thorns, an acorn on top, and supposedly foliage coming out of it. So in the Antichrist and a Cup of Tea, including the first edition, I pointed out, that the patron goddess of witchcraft, the name is Diana, just like we read in Ephesians. I think it's chapter 5, but in Ephesians in the New Testament, the patron goddess of witchcraft, her name is Diana. Charles at Cambridge, when he studied anthropology and so forth, and history, studied about witchcraft, and that included the mythology around the dying god king and the priestess who could be sacrificed also. Now, Charles coming along saying, I'm the green man, basically, is portraying himself as the dying god king, the god of the wood, if you will, the god of witchcraft, of, even for this matter, druidry, and so forth. And then with the crown of thorns on his head. So in other words, he is setting the tone as the fourth horseman of the apocalypse to be martyred, to be killed, with all of that imagery, as a Christ-like figure, literally as the Antichrist, on that invitation with that green man head and the crown of thorns around it.
Ooh, so to be killed and then come back to life.
Yes, he knows that that's his future. I pointed out even in the first edition of the book that he's known since he was a child that he's the Antichrist. He's known all this time who he actually is. And I believe that initially because he had deep knowledge of his own heraldic achievement based on quotes that I found in biographies from him, which he shouldn't have known unless he was really studying it purposely for a reason, purposefully. How many, even these people who are given these coats of arms usually don't have a deep knowledge of the meaning of the symbols on them, but he did from his youth, from the time that it was given to him. So, and there were other things, but that being said, on the invitation is also his state, his majesty's version of his royal coat of arms. His new one is king. And Camilla's, hers. Hers has a blue boar on it, a swine. So we've got the imagery of desecration, an unclean creature on the invitation. And then there's a boar's head also on Camilla's heraldic achievement in one of the quarters in the center of her achievement, her coat of arms on that invitation. And it's her state coat of arms. So the boar on that, along with the lion and leopard that are on Charles, those three symbols are also mixed into the rest of the invitation. In the foliage, you'll find them mixed in with the foliage, along with a bee and a butterfly and so forth. And the butterfly, represents resurrection coming out of a cocoon. So the symbols of death and resurrection are hidden in the invitation. And the boar is unusual because normally in every heraldic boar I've ever seen until this one, you could see the two tusks from the boar, the two long teeth, if you will. On this one, you only see one, and they did that on purpose to make it look like a unicorn. They extended the length of it off the jaw, and they only show one to make it look like a unicorn for Camilla. So those are some of the strange things on his invitation to the 2,000 people who received it. Now, the seats in which they sat, the most prominent people, the royals, the royals, and then behind them, the other seats. But the royals, and the most prominent guests who received those invitations also, the seats in which they sat had a blue velvet-like back. And in the two upper corners of each of those were the ciphers of Charles and Camilla, their royal ciphers. Hers having the 666 buried in it on the seats in which these people sat. And her own pinkish coronation chair, and she and Charles had one each next to each other. So there were basically 5 chairs at this event. Mm-hmm. There was St. Edward's throne, which had the stone of Scone and the stone of Destiny in its base. And I'll talk more about that later. And then there were 2 pinkish chairs with footstool type things in front of them that were cushy, that had the ciphers of Charles and Camilla on their backs, respectively. And then there were the 2, we'll call them coronation chairs, but they're also thrones, that on the front and back of their backrests, both sides for Charles and Camilla each, had their royal coats of arms or heraldic achievements. So there was also a Roman Catholic archbishop, I believe, present at the coronation, not just Anglican, also something new, historically not done before. Besides Greek Orthodox patriarch and the Justin Welby, the Anglican archbishop, okay, all apostates. But the people who Charles greeted and who participated subsequently in the event, I made a list of what they represented: Baha'i, Jain, Zoroastrianism, Buddhist or Buddhism, Sikh, Shia and Sunni Muslim both, non-believing rabbis, so unbelieving Judaism, archbishops of Wales and Scotland, and Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox archbishops also.
Okay. All right.
And that's besides Druids, by the way.
Oh.
So we'll get into the Druidic imagery also a bit later.
Okay, but for people who are watching who, don't know anything about scripture, or, okay, a lot of what you're talking about is prophecies that were written 2,000 years ago and even before. But they'll just go, well, isn't that nice that he's going to be defender of the defender of faiths, or instead of defender of the faith? Isn't that great? He's just like bringing everybody together. Isn't that wonderful?
Janie, it's the same thing as saying, let's all worship the devil together and be happy. There's no difference. Right, I'm going to defend your right to worship the devil, and I'm going to protect you as you worship the devil. It's saying exactly the same thing.
Right. And the Bible also warned against a one world religion, because ultimately the Antichrist is going to say, you worship me, because he's going to be over that.
Well, and he's the green man. He's like, hey, worship the devil any way you like. Call him whatever you want. Do it however you want. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's tolerance for everything except what's actually true. Charles pushed back against a strictly Christian coronation. And it's interesting, too, if you go and look at the reactions before the event, while this debate supposedly was happening behind the scenes with the Archbishop of Canterbury and others in that communion, about whether Charles would be, saying he'd be defender of the faith, as opposed to faith or faiths or religions or this kind of thing. The non-Christians in the public were basically saying, well, there's nothing wrong with him saying defender of the faith. After all, it's a Christian ceremony and he's supposed to be a Christian. Why should anybody in the public be complaining about that? It was very surprising. In other words, the non-Christians in the public were almost entirely supporting the idea that Charles would have a strictly Christian coronation. It was Charles himself who didn't want that. So, in other words, he wasn't doing this to represent the people. They might have been happy. In fact, I'm sure they were happier with what he did do, but they weren't complaining about the notion of him doing something that would have been strictly Christian in terms of the language and the participation, like what his mother did. Right? It was Charles who wanted that as the Antichrist under the devil. So, coming back to all of this, as Charles was entering the abbey, he passed under a curved golden arch that was triangular, pyramidal at its top. And in the center of that arch was the all-seeing eye of Lucifer. And in the center of that all-seeing eye, there is a shield with a cross in it to try to Christianize it, if you will. Now, the top backrest of the throne, St. Edward's throne, that's hundreds of years old, that has the stone of destiny in the center of it, is also triangular. And when the monarch is sitting there, their head and their face are right in front of that triangle. When the crown is put on their head, with the orb at the top of the crown, to signify them being over the world, not just the British Empire or Commonwealth, but over the world, as a supposed Christian monarch, their head is in the place of the all-seeing eye. In other words, against the backrest of the throne. In other words, it's portraying the British monarch, if you will, as the all-seeing eye.
Oh, wow. So it's like
when
really
the crown's put on their head.
Okay, and so it's really Freemasonry.
Yes, it is. And likewise, in the Parliament, when they have the state opening of Parliament and these other events, there are two thrones, one for the British monarch, one for the Prince of Wales of the day. They both have that same symbolism at the top of them. So when the monarch and the Prince of Wales are sitting there, in that situation, in that context, it's also their heads, their faces being in the place of the all-seeing eye.
Now,
this is deeply ingrained in
right.
the occultism of British royalty.
Right. Now, something also that you said about the Commonwealth that a lot of people don't know, and this is a quote from NPR also, they said, Charles isn't just king to England, Scotland, Wales, and North Ireland, but he's also the head of 14 Commonwealth countries, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, some islands in the Pacific, and the Caribbean. So a lot of people don't realize that.
Yeah, in fact, there used to be, when the first edition of the Antichrist and Cup of Tea came out, 53 nations in the British Commonwealth. There are now 56. So it was about a quarter of the world's population. Now it's about a third of the world's population in the Commonwealth. Oh. Of those, the 14 or so nations you're talking about, explicitly represent the British monarchy as their monarchy. So Charles is their king. And part of what's so significant about that a lot of the public, including these people, don't realize, these nations in many cases, is that for Charles to be their king, or previously Elizabeth II to have been their queen, all of their territory, all of their resources nationally belong to the crown. Technically. Whether the British monarchy could ever utilize all of that or any of it, we can't say, right? But technically and historically, all of their territory, all of their national resources, everything in the ground, etc., belongs to the crown for those nations. If you add up the wealth of that, Janie, even try to calculate it, it's tens of trillions with a T dollars in wealth.
Now it reminds me of what he said, trillions at his disposal in one of his speeches.
Trillions at his disposal, but under the crown, you could combine all the billionaires of the world in the whole history of the world, who are known billionaires, and the wealth of the crown exponentially dwarfs them all combined. And that's under Charles now. Whether he could avail himself of it or not is another argument entirely. But I point that out in the second edition of the Antichrist and Cup, and I even pointed it out in the first one.
Oh, okay. Now I want to ask you, what else did we miss in the coronation that we just didn't realize what they were trying to really say to us? All right.
So he's passed under this all-seeing eye arch, heading toward where all these chairs and the chairs are and the throne is, right? I've said there are 5 of them, right? So he's being preceded by the cross. He's greeted all these pagans. He is going to sit down on these, he and Camilla, on these pinkish, cushiony chairs with the stools in front of them and a pew kind of thing above the stools on which to put, for example, a Bible and so forth. So he can both kneel before that, so could Camilla. And, there can be things in front of them on those pinkish, cushiony chairs. Now, each of those chairs have their ciphers. One for Charles, one for Camilla, slightly different. Hers has the 3 6s interwoven, hidden in its base. Now, Charles sits down, Camilla sits down. They bring him a Bible that was created specially for the coronation. There are only a couple copies of it in existence, that has the royal coat of arms on its cover. There were 3 Bibles that were commissioned for this event, all King James Version Bibles, authorized King James Version. 2 by Oxford Press, 1 by Cambridge, the King's Press. The 2 that are available for public purchase have King Charles' cipher on their cover. The one that he used, which is not available for public purchase, has his coat of arms on the cover. Ostensibly, all of them have his coat of arms on the title page inside. So, that Bible was brought to Charles. He kissed it. He treated it as a relic, almost. At that point, now this is before he's been anointed with oil or crowned or any of that. He goes through all of that. There are some prayers by the Archbishop of Canterbury and others around him, including over this flask that in the public broadcasts of this, the commenters would say, it looks like an eagle, this golden flask. This flask contained the oil. It's an ampulla containing the oil for the coronation. In this case, it's oil produced in Jerusalem, especially for Charles, from olives grown on the Mount of Olives. Now, the word Messiah means anointed. Mashiach is anointed. Christ or Christos is anointed. One a Hebrew word, one a Greek word, both mean anointed. So when Charles was anointed, subsequently, he was what? Made a Messiah. In this context, a little Messiah, if you will. In this case, the big one, the Antichrist, the anti-Messiah. But continuing, so this flask is not an eagle. It's actually a phoenix, Janie, like a risen phoenix, risen from the ashes.
More symbolism.
Yep, in which they put the oil. The neck is not short like you'd have on an eagle or a dove, even. and the wings don't match an eagle's or a dove's, but all of that, all the proportions of that thing match some portrayals of a phoenix historically, which comes out of ancient Egyptian paganism, in fact. And it has to do with the death and resurrection of a god.
So here we go again, death and resurrection.
God, yeah. Now, normally at these events, historically, they would have a chuppah, derived from a Jewish chuppah, in fact, historically, over this throne on which the monarch would sit, under the chuppah, and the monarch would be anointed and receive the various vestments and so forth. And people can go and look at the event in 1953 for Queen Elizabeth II, and they'll see Knights of the Order of the Garter holding the 4 poles of the chuppah, the canopy over the throne, under which the queen was, anointed and crowned. And they could hear, the public could hear everything that was said.
This was different.
She was crowned. Yep, she was crowned Queen of thy people, Israel, quote unquote. And the throne, that Edward's throne that has the, St. Edward's throne that has the stone of Scone, or the stone of destiny, they call it, at the base, is claimed to be the throne of King David. Officially, that's the claim they make, the British monarchy. So Charles got rid of the chuppah, the covering that would have been over his head, and had this screen, 3-sided screen, around the chair. So it was moved to be put around the chair. Then he disrobed so that all he had under that was a simple white garment, almost like a bedtime garment, but you could think of the white robes of druids, okay? And the reason I bring that up is all of the royal women participating, including Kate and Camilla, wore white dresses that were similar to white druidic robes.
Oof.
Not what was done historically. Historically, at every prior coronation that you can find any record of historically, any photo or any artwork around it, the women are wearing, fancy dresses, of the culture of the time. Always. So this was something never done before again at one of these events. These women were all dressed like they were going to be brides to Charles or something. Okay, but in a satanic druidic ceremony. So the screen itself had 3 sides. 2 of the sides, left and right, you could see a cross. That's what was on 2 of the sides, just a cross on the outside and the inside. On the back, which everybody publicly could see, was this fake tree of life with Charles' cipher at the very base of it. Like an oak stalk. It's supposed to be like an oak tree with his cipher at the base of it. And all the leaves have the names of the Commonwealth nations embroidered in them. So the 56 nations of the Commonwealth. And then you've got birds and other things in the tree. And at the base is a motto that says something like, and I forget the exact meaning of it, but all is well, all shall be well, or something like that, I think is what it means. But it's a serpent-like banner at the base of the tree. So it's a fake tree of life that was put between Charles and all the attendees, everyone, all the guests, right? And while that was happening, there was loud singing and other stuff, so nobody could hear what he was saying behind the screen.
Yeah, now, which is interesting because PBS made a very interesting comment. They said, he just wants to be private with his God. That was the exact words they said.
That's right, the devil. And I would bet that he was pledging allegiance to the devil right there himself behind that screen. And I'm not saying that tongue in cheek at all.
No, I understand. It was very, very private. And everyone was even talking about it, that it was very private.
Yeah, so they took him behind that screen after he'd kissed the Bible and they'd read some things and all that. And the prayers had gone on around this ampulla shaped like a risen phoenix, from the ashes. And the base of that bird has almost like fiery coal-like artistry at the base of it, upon which it's standing, but it's all gold. So you don't really see the colors there. It's just like fiery gold, if you will. So that contains that oil specially made for Charles to anoint him. So, and the oil is put on his head, chest, and arms, right? Where was the oil put on Christ prior to his crucifixion? His feet, by Mary Magdalene. So this is a rejection of that. This is saying, I'm not going to be humble. I'm going to be proud. Put the oil on my head, arms, and my chest. And that's traditionally where they put it, right? For the British monarchs. That's where the Queen got it also.
Okay.
But so he was anointed from that flask, the risen phoenix flask, that symbolism that supposedly is supposed to represent the Holy Spirit, but the Holy Spirit's a dove. That's the imagery in Scripture, not a phoenix, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in other words, that associates Charles right there with ancient Egyptian paganism and all sorts of occult stuff surrounding the phoenix historically. So that oil from Jerusalem is now poured on his head behind that screen. Things are said nobody hears. Now, here's another very important point. The stone in the base of that throne is called Jacob's headstone, Jacob's pillar stone. They claim that that stone of destiny or stone of scoon is something on which Jacob rested his head when he had the vision of the angels going up and down the ladder historically, the same night, I believe it was, when he wrestled with the angel of the Lord. And instead of the Lord killing Jacob, he crippled him in his thigh at that time.
Now,
he saw God face to face and lived.
Right. Now, why would they want, even though I don't believe it's the real one, not the real Jacob's pillow?
Well, I'm coming to that.
Why would they? Yeah.
It's actually quarried from Scotland historically, hundreds of years ago. They know this from the chemistry in the stone. They've identified more or less the location from which it came. But there's this fraud, if you will, that's been perpetrated by British monarchs and royalty upon the public, saying it's Jacob's stone to give them this air of authority, if you will, right? But here's the rub on this. It's actually a Druidic Logan stone, which is the same thing as a Druidic throne stone and the same thing as a sacrificial altar for Druids where they would sacrifice human beings historically. It's a little Druidic Logan stone, and Charles is sitting right atop that thing in a white robe with the oil, from Jerusalem poured from a phoenix flask on top of his head, saying who knows what, hidden from the public, right? And by the way, this is right before he asked the world to give allegiance to him. For all we know, he was actually possessed by Satan, the actual angel of death, in those moments while that was being poured over his head to anoint him as the Antichrist, quite literally. Okay? At his investor in July 1969, when he became Prince of the Red Dragon, Prince of Satan, as we talked about in our prior interview, there was no anointing with oil at that event.
Now, do they usually do that at an investiture?
Well, no, not as Prince of Wales.
Right.
He was only the 21st. He was the 21st Prince of Wales in all history, and only a few of them had ever been presented publicly in an investiture. A handful. His was the most ornate, most unique investiture in the history of the world, not just as Prince of Wales at that time, but like ever in all history of the entire world. There's never been anything to compare to his investiture as Satan's prince in July 1969. Now we come to this coronation, and in some ways, he is outdoing it. He's behind this fake tree of life with a serpent at the base of it in this banner saying to the world, everything's going to be okay. All is well, all shall be well. The Commonwealth nations represented as the leaves of the tree. And Charles is on record in the past as saying he'd rather it wasn't the British Commonwealth, but that it was the Commonwealth of the nations, of the whole world. He wants the whole world to be part of that Commonwealth, right? And I quoted this, by the way, in the first edition of the Antichrist and Cup of Tea published in 1998. The quotes are in the book, including in the second edition. And he said this to women who had, come from the UK to live in the United States when he was over here, because they were playing up the Commonwealth to him in a dialogue. And he was basically saying to them, I really wish it was the whole world that was the Commonwealth, in essence, is what he was saying to them. So now, behind this screen, representing this fake tree of life in the Commonwealth, the satanic thing is being done over this Logan stone with him and this oil. And when this is finished, he comes out to finally sit. Well, not to sit, but he stands up. They remove the screens. And then in succession, they give him the vestments of royalty. And then he sits down and he's crowned. But let's go through some of the stuff that was done and who did it, because the pagans directly participated in this part. Normally, it would only be Christian priests, and like the archbishop and so forth, who would be, and of course, the Order of the Garter members, they were always pagans and Satanists, but they claimed to be Christians, okay? Just to be clear, there were Satanists participating in past royal coronations, but they didn't say anything publicly, and as far as the public was concerned, They were quote unquote Christian.
So this is
This was
when they were presenting different things to him, like a ring, or and present different people presenting different things. Is that what you're going
yes.
to
I'm
be
going to
talking?
go down the line of of some of that. Charles was wearing his Black Prince badge ring the whole time on his pinky finger. The entire event that was on him, even when he was only wearing that white robe. So he was still representing himself as the Prince of Darkness, or the Black Prince, if you will.
Which is the meaning behind his ring?
Yes, one meaning. The three ostrich feathers also symbolize 666 as Bob, Bob, Bob. So I guess that's a fourth instance, if you will, of 666 hidden in the investiture or the coronation ceremony. So now let's get into who gave him what and what they represented. After he came out, so a golden robe was put on him over that white garment and a belt around it. So a symbol of royalty, in other words. And then they, in succession, began to give him the vestments of royalty before he's crowned. So the first thing was the spurs. They're golden spurs of knights, the symbolism of knighthood. Then they gave him the bracelets of sincerity and wisdom, which are, quote, tokens of the Lord's protection on every side. So they gave him the bracelets of sincerity and wisdom, 2 golden bracelets with some other symbolism and things on them. So a Muslim handed him the bracelets. The imperial mantle that was put over Charles, that ermine mantle, was given to him by an unbelieving Jewess. Then the stow, or the sash, that was put over Charles' shoulders was put on him by William, the current Prince of Wales. He was created Prince of Wales, never been invested Prince of Wales. And Charles was created Prince of Wales in 1958 by his mother publicly. He wasn't actually invested formally and crowned until 1969. Mm-hmm. William might never be invested Prince of Wales. He's only, quote unquote, created that by declaration at this point. So the stow was put on Charles' shoulders around the current Prince of Wales. The golden orb, and by the way, just to reiterate, Charles retains his heraldic achievement, his coat of arms, as Prince of Wales. That prophecy to identify him as the Antichrist in Revelation chapter 13 is already fulfilled. It no longer matters how his name or title calculates. He's already been identified biblically as the Antichrist. Revelation 13:18 is already fulfilled, but he does retain that heraldic achievement. So continuing, the golden orb, which has the cross above it and represents actually the earth, the sphere of the earth is what it's meant to represent under Christ originally, is handed to the British sovereign to say, now you under Christ are over the whole world, basically. The golden orb was handed to Charles by an archbishop. Then Lord Patel, the Hindu who read the passage of scripture, the prime minister, or excuse me, not the prime minister, a different Hindu, I mean to say, Lord Patel, he's called Lord, a Hindu, gave Charles the ring of sovereignty that was put on his hand, in addition to his what's on his pinky, which was his Black Prince badge golden ring that he's worn since before he married Diana. Never been seen publicly without it the whole time since. I don't know of a single instance where he wasn't wearing it publicly, where he wasn't ever photographed without it the whole time in all these decades. All right, the next thing is that a Sikh, Lord Singh, a Sikh, and I think that's his name, but a Sikh gave the glove, a white glove, to Charles that he put on one hand. And then the royal scepter and rod of equity. They changed the wording a little bit. Equity, this wokeness, right? They handed the royal scepter and the rod of equity to him, which was given to him by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So now he is giving something to Charles. These are like the final things before the crown. The scepter has a purple orb and a cross at the top above a huge diamond in the top of it. Very, very opulent. One of the largest diamonds in the history of the world ever found. Beautiful diamond. So that's at the top of the scepter. And then atop the other rod, the rod of equity, next to the royal scepter, atop that rod is a white dove. That actually is a dove on top of that scepter. So that is what was given to Charles. Now, the next thing is the Archbishop of Canterbury put the crown on his head. Now, it's not the same crown as the state crown for the UK. It was St. Edward's crown. So there were 2 different crowns that went on Charles' head. that day besides the crown that went on Camilla's head. So they put St. Edward's crown on his head, which is again connected to this throne that has the Logan stone in its base, this Druidic stone in its base. Now, the crown that was put on Charles' head to crown him Prince of Wales had a Druidic origin, and that's documented in the Antichrist and a Cup of Tea. Its design was Druidic from the start, custom made for Charles for his investiture as Prince of Wales. And they added crosses made of gold nails and other things around it and put the orb atop it with a cross made of gold nails. That was his crown as Prince of Wales. This crown, St. Edward's crown, which has a similar origin historically, but not particularly customized for Charles, was put on his head. He was crowned. So now he's been anointed. He's received the gold robe. He's received the vestments, and now he's been crowned. So after this is all done, and the pagans have all participated, around all of that, Charles pledged to, and this is not the precise wording, but basically to uphold their right to worship and to protect or defend, and this part is a quote, every faith and belief, end quote, in the United Kingdom and the whole world. And you've got this sword of state, right, which is one of the things that he was given. Also, temporarily, I think I left that out of my list here, the female government employee who handed him the sword briefly. Well, she held it. I don't recall if she handed it to somebody else who handed it to him. But anyway, it went from her initially and back to her at the end. And of course, she carried it before him in the coronation, before all of that. Anyway, you know, with the real tree of life, there was the cherubim, right, who had a sword that went every which way to protect the sword of the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. So mankind couldn't go back to that tree after being expelled from the Garden of Eden, right? Here, you have a fake tree of life behind which I wouldn't be surprised if it was like the devil behind that screen tempting him like he tempted Eve, you know, on the tree of life historically. But now you've got the sword leading Charles, not keeping him out of the garden, if you will, this fake tree of life and what was behind it symbolically, right? Not protecting that against the world. But you've got this pagan, this satanic tree of life that represents fallen mankind, the fallen nations of the Commonwealth, right? Okay. So now Charles and Camilla head back to the coach that they're going to return to Buckingham Palace in. So when he gets there, you get this salute to Charles from 4,000 military personnel from all the branches of the UK's military who have arrayed themselves in a park right before Buckingham Palace and before that balcony where Charles and Camilla and the other royals are going to appear. And so all these people now multiple times have said, God save the king. And I see some people commenting, Janie, you know, let's pray for Charles for salvation, this kind of thing. In some of the comments under some of the presentations giving the evidence that he's the Antichrist. I want to say to the audience, and listen to this, folks, that is a failed prayer. Charles cannot be saved. He's already destined to hell, the same as Judas Iscariot was. His fate is sealed. It will never be altered. He will never be saved. He cannot be saved any more than Judas Iscariot can be saved. So I want to be clear about that. Don't even bother to pray for the guy for salvation. He's the devil's child at this point. That's what he's been his whole life. And that's what he's going to be to the end, as the devil's servant. And I'm not speaking of William or Harry. Do pray for them and pray for their wives and their families for salvation, okay? They can be saved if they repent and genuinely become Christians. Not one of them is a Christian to this day. There's not a single royal in the British monarchy who is a Christian to this day, so far as anybody can tell. Not one of them has any discernment of the fact that Charles is the Antichrist, it appears. Or they know, and they're going along with it and don't care. More likely, it's the latter. So that being said, all these people saluted Charles before this balcony. There was a flyover of military craft, helicopters and jets.
I saw that, and I saw red, white, and blue.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a combination of 60 aircraft for 6 minutes. And there was some other 6 in there. I forget what now. Maybe it was just the fact that it was May 6th. I don't know. But there was supposed to be another representation of 666 in that. It didn't happen because it was a rainy day. And so they flew fewer craft. But there were still helicopters and the jets that you saw. So that part didn't happen, but it was pre-planned. I want to get into one other thing, and that is the coronation concert the following day. Now, you and I talked about Charles having engaged the world in Molech worship, Baal Molech worship. Baal worship, the Baal Molech bull idol at Birmingham, England for the 2022, the 22nd Commonwealth Games, right? This giant mechanical bull. Now,
right,
a bull
and
is
the
a
Tower
major
of Babel
symbol.
too.
Correct. Yes, the mock Tower of Babel, the whole deal. The serpent coiling in the tower, the Luciferian all-seeing eye appearing over the tower and then migrating to be over the bull, representing Lucifer even as an alien, a quote-unquote alien, a recreation, in fact. And I don't know if I mentioned this when you and I talked, but that was a recreation of the Battle of Los Angeles in 1942 with an anti-gravity craft, an actual flying saucer, flew in off the coast of California, appeared over Los Angeles, and was fired upon for a lengthy period of time, many thousands of rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition fired upon it to try to down it by the U.S. Army. That was filmed. The event was filmed, and it was photographed, and it was reported on in the mainstream press. And you can see that on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/author Tim Cohen. Go to the playlist on UFOs and quote-unquote aliens, and you can actually pull up the clip and see the actual film footage of the Battle of Los Angeles. But you can also see the still photo, the most prominent one that was in all the newspapers at the time. A lot of the public today has never heard of this, but it was a major national event at the time because it was an incursion. Nobody knew where this craft came. They couldn't down it after all these rounds of ammunition were fired at it. And it was tracked on radar coming off the coast and then leaving Los Angeles. So,
okay, but wait a minute. But you said an actual UFO. Now, you don't believe in aliens like living on other planets. I mean, because to me, they're demonic entities.
Well, we'll define aliens. So you have to understand what the word means. So when people talk about aliens, they're normally talking about creatures that originated on some other world. That would be real aliens. The only real aliens who exist are angels, if you want to call them aliens, okay? Mm-hmm. Even the demons aren't real aliens because they're related to us genetically, biologically. Demons are disembodied Nephilim. They're the killed human-angel hybrids. That's what they are. They're the disembodied spirits of killed Nephilim and Noah's flood who now seek bodies to possess. So they're related, demons are, to humans and to fallen angels, both. That being said, if you want to say they're aliens, you can get away with that. But there are no real aliens. However, there are fake aliens. So there are chimeric hybrids produced from life on Earth that the Nephilim seeded not just to Earth, but all over our solar system. So the dangerous dinosaurs like T-Rex, Velociraptor, etc., that existed while the Earth was becoming filled with violence before Noah's flood, they coexisted with mankind before Noah's flood on Earth. Those dangerous dinosaurs weren't part of God's original creation. They were chimeric hybrids produced by the Nephilim, and they were seeding those creatures, life from Earth, and all sorts of other hybrids all over our solar system. I'm not just saying that. So these are fake aliens that actually exist. There are other chimeric humanoids like the Nephilim, but also produced from other life on Earth in these anti-gravity craft today. So what I'm saying is these creatures exist, but genetically they derive from the life God originally made himself here on Earth. So they're not real aliens, they're fake aliens. They're counterfeits meant to deceive mankind into thinking, A, aliens are real, B, because we're genetically related to them, that maybe they did create us, that the real God, the God of the Bible, didn't, but maybe they did. And that they're corporeal, that they can be killed. So the creatures in the craft, in many cases, have flesh and bone like we do and can be killed. So they're not, in other words, angels. They're fake humanoids, genetically related to us. So that being said, when a demon possesses one of them, they become a Nephil.
Okay, but when you were talking about the Commonwealth, you said that was a recreation then of the event.
So the craft that came in off of the coast of California over Los Angeles, you look up the photo in the newspaper, it's got multiple beams of light, multiple spotlights concentrated on it at the top. So you've got these streaks of spotlights going down almost pyramidally, radiating around it to the ground, that are being shown on it while they're trying to shoot this thing down. And in the center of these spotlights is a disc-shaped craft. So what they did over the bowl at the Commonwealth Games, when this all-seeing eye migrated to be over the bowl, they had all these spotlights that shone over the bowl in that exact same pattern. And you can go back and watch the event and take stills of that and then compare that when these spotlights were over the bowl, so that the all-seeing eye was at the center of them over the bowl, in the center of the arena, or the field, and compare that to the still photo that was popularized in the press of the Battle of Los Angeles. You'll see it's almost identical in appearance. That was done on purpose to suggest that to those who believe that the aliens did it, that the aliens created mankind, rather than the God of the Bible creating us, to suggest to them that Lucifer is an angel. That was the point of it. That was one of the things that was implied in the ceremony, beyond what I shared with you previously. But I'm going there because Charles, a lot of people claim that he is, and that the royal family are reptilians or reptoids, that they're humanoids, and that their eyes change and that they can physically change to look like Nephilim. Shapeshift. Yeah, I don't believe that's true. It's something popularized by David Icke. Mm-hmm. But they are associated with the UFO phenomena. So, for example, Prince Philip, Charles' father, had a room, with at least a full wall dedicated just to UFOs that he tracked in sightings around the world. He had meetings with the top people in the UK and the European Union, back then the EEC and the world, and military and government officials on UFOs. He wanted to know everything he could learn about them. And he also, according to somebody who worked for him, had a UFO hover over his home and a humanoid occupant get out of it and meet with him to talk with him, who was telepathic but otherwise looked human. These are all firsthand accounts. This is not lore. And people can go look that up on the internet. But anyway, the disc, the dais, I should say, on which Charles was invested Prince of Wales was round, right? If you look at it from above, the disc on which the 3 thrones were placed for his investiture, one for him, one for his mother with a backrest in the center, one for Prince Philip, above was shaped like a UFO, a flying saucer. And that was on purpose. It was also a Druidic Logan stone. It was multiple things at once.
That was in 1969.
Yes, that's all documented in the AntiChrist and Cup of Tea. That round disc is still there. People can look at overhead photos of Caernarvon Castle today, and they can see exactly what it looks like today in those photos. So it's still there. But that being said, what I was wanting to bring up with, adding all these little interesting tidbits, is that bull represented Molech, not just Baal. So the bull at the event is a symbol historically, not just for Baal, but also for Molech. Molech was also represented as an owl historically. And owls were symbols of fallen angels to mankind in paganism, because they've got the big eyes and this kind of thing. The reason for that is because gray humanoids, these humanoids I'm talking about, have these big solid black eyes, similar to owls, with these bulbous heads. Gray humanoids actually exist. And that's one category of the humanoids piloting these anti-gravity craft, the ones that aren't ours. Mankind has its own at this point. We've reverse engineered those. We've been given some of the technology. Our government has them. Some other governments have them. Secret projects and some of the military industrial complex has them. This is all hidden from the public. And it's been done to prepare for Armageddon. So that's another story. But the point I want to make is the reason that owls are associated with fallen angels is because of gray humanoids. That's the reason, because of their bulbous eyes. Now, Charles had a coronation concert the next day that lasted for hours. There's never been one before in history. That was also completely new and done for him.
And what was the purpose of it? What kind of music was it?
Well, it was very interesting because it was all Satanists who participated primarily, and non-Christians and Satanists. So among them would be Lionel Richie. He's a non-Christian. In my view, he's a Satanist. Katy Perry, nobody can dispute that she's a Satanist and has actually given her life to the devil. And if you look at her concerts and ceremonies, it's always filled with Egyptian and other satanic and all-seeing eye and pagan ceremony on purpose. Everything she's done publicly, just about. except here she was dressed nicely for this when she sang. But she sang, Lionel Richie sang. The lyrics that they sang were tied into the world giving fealty to Charles and other things like that. So that's documented in the second edition of my book, delayed slightly to get all that in there. And but still shipping in the same time frame everybody's been told. And then they had a lot of things with light shows. So not just the rainbow type colors, behind these performers and over their heads, which was done, but they also had a display of drones, as dots of light in the sky, making various formations. And so a lot of eco-fascism, global, this climate change stuff and carbon pollution and eco-fascism was all woven into this thing. Tom Cruise made an appearance in his aircraft with sheep pilots. And he basically told King Charles III, "You can be my wingman anytime." This was his cameo. Tom Cruise did that while he was flying, and some film footage that they showed at the event. He's Scientologist. Scientology is satanic. He's right at there at the top in Scientology, Tom Cruise is, and he funds a lot of it over the years he has. But part of the drone display was going through various creatures. So they had a bee, and they had a whale, and they had a bird, as if it was drinking water, like a stork or whatever it was. I'm not sure. And then they had at the end, I think it was the final thing that they showed, this giant owl's head over everyone at the concert with the drone display. Moloch, in other words.
Right, signifying Moloch. Yep, Moloch
signifying
worship.
Moloch.
Tim, thank you so much for all this information. And I want you to give your website on where people can get your materials, not just the Antichrist and a cup of tea, but you have amazing other materials. So yeah, give your website.
Yes, the website is prophecyhouse.com, prophecyhouse.com. I'm the author of The Antichrist and a Cup of Tea, published in 1998. I began to write it in 1987 while I was a cadet at the Air Force Academy. And I have many other books coming, including several that I started while I was still at the Academy, such as the Messiah, History and the Tribulation Period multi-volume series. I have another book out, Janie, called North Korea, Iran, and the Coming World War, Behold a Red Horse, that identifies the second horseman of the apocalypse and that fiery red horse. Another book coming on the four horsemen of the apocalypse that identifies the first and third horsemen and their horses. And two other multi-volume series, one dealing with fake aliens, the series titled Solar Apocalypse, what actually exists in our solar system on the moon, Mars, comets, and asteroids. So not what the space agencies have publicly admitted, but all the photos I share are from the space agencies. They'll be independently verifiable and downloadable from the agencies themselves, showing complex biological creatures on Mars, the moon, comets and asteroids, mostly fossils, some possibly still alive on Mars, including dinosaurs, like the dinosaurs on Earth. So things the public hasn't been told, but I'm giving the proof in that Solar Apocalypse series. And then a series called Israel, quote unquote, Peace and the Coming World War, the Great Tribulation is Near, or the Looming World War. That title may change a little bit by the time it's published, but 3 multi-volume series coming, dozens of books, some individual books apart from all that as well.
Okay, and I also want everyone to look at the other videos, the other interviews I did with Tim, because he explains even the objections where people go, oh no, he's supposed to be loved, or he's supposed to be, the Antichrist is supposed to be this or that, or he's supposed to be 33 years old. He answers all those objections on my other videos. So thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you, Janie. God bless.